is the nature of terrorism, along with its proliferation and inexact subject. Indeed, terrorism is now a famous term, with its usage being broadly placed. Now, how do we define this? And of course, what are the cycles revolving around terror? Welcome, I am Night Owl, and I believe we can investigate both political and economic phenomena in a way that can benefit us both. So with that being said, let's get started. It's been said that all history is contemporary history. So in the case of terrorism, we should take special care in our analysis. However, it would be prudent to define the term. Regrettably, this has yet to be done. A commonly received definition on terrorism still eludes the mainstream. Nevertheless, we can go over differing descriptions. For example, Caleb Carr in his work Lessons of Terror defines it as warfare deliberately waged against civilians with the purpose of destroying their will to support the leaders, policies, and agents of such violence they find objectionable. And about Gerard, Chailand, and Arnaud's work, The History of Terrorism, they espouse that terrorism is a technique or a tool in which a terrorist act leaves behind a psychological impact that is greater than the physical. Similarly, Bobbitt in his famous work Terror and Consent urged that terrorism has the potential to undermine the integrity and value of a state itself, that it destroys the domestic contract between the government and its citizenry by undermining its ability to protect citizens of a given nation-state. Adding on to this notion, in the book The Mind of the Terrorist by Jerrold M states that terrorism is violence or the threat of violence against non-combatants or property in order to gain a political, ideological, or religious goal through fear and intimidation. There are many other definitions concerning terrorism. However, many of them hold key commonalities: that terrorism is a strategy of insurgency or a tactic of war, that it distinguishes itself from other forms of warfighting by its use of deliberately targeting civilians. Simply put, terrorism is rooted within political and ideological purposes. It is not done as a criminal act for monetary gain. And according to terror expert Alex Schmidt, called attention between the targets of violence and attention. The former would apply to innocent victims or non-combatants of an attack. The latter, however, is the primary point where insurgents wish to voice their grievances. This target includes the average individual looking at the event through the internet or television screen. According to Schmidt, targets of attention have three subcategories. They are targets of terror, demands, and influence. The first of which refers to the members of the class the victims belong in. When concerning the niche terror attacks, or in Belgium, this would apply to the French, the Belgians, or the West in general. The target of demands, as the name suggests, involves extortion. For example, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi demanded that the Philippine government withdraw her troops from Iraq. Failure to comply would be met with the beheading of a Philippine contractor, an exchange that her government ultimately agreed to. Moving on, the target of influence applies to an audience watching the event taking place, which includes the average Joe watching events unfold from afar. I hope by these descriptions, this video essay can provide simplified introductory material in regards to terror. In consideration of this, let's take a brief historical account behind the tactic. As stated by the material cited, terrorism is a tactic of war, generally used by weaker forces to strike at the strong. One historical example may include the Zealots who incited terror against the Roman occupants during the 1st century. This case is especially noteworthy as the Zealots grew in popularity in a rather unique manner. Many in Judea were unhappy that they were administered by the Romans. The Zealots, as a result, utilized terror acts against the Roman occupants to both demoralize them and to grow their movements, in this case between the actual terror agents and the entity they are fighting against. What proliferated support for the Zealots was public legitimacy. As Zealots committed acts of terror against the Romans, they in turn fought back, and often over-aggressively, which caused a unique phenomena. As the Romans reacted to the Zealots, they became more authoritative towards the citizenry of Judea, which in turn tarnished their own public image, ultimately giving more legitimacy towards the Zealots, thereby making the Zealots appear more as freedom fighters than radicals as far as public image is concerned. Moving on to more contemporary debates, many nation-states categorize terrorism as merely a criminal act. There are issues with this line of thought, however. Unlike terrorism, Organized crime is motivated by monetary gain, whereas terror cells seek out broad social change and is rooted in ideology, often political in nature. Many terror experts would agree that terrorism is a form of warfare, in that it would be more opportune to construct a stratagem specifically designed to address it, instead of fighting terror using similar tactics of combating crime. The reason why I emphasize this distinction is through its own practice. Many members of terrorist cells, including the Islamic State, al-Nusra, and so on, all declare themselves to be soldiers and militants fighting for a particular cause, and thus see the world in a very simplified perspective. Moreover, if terrorism is a form of warfare, let's see if we address it as such. Let's include society, economy, and political environments into our analysis, which may lead to this question: is the environment a major factor in the proliferation of terrorism? In a paper known as In Poverty, Political Freedom and the Roots of Terrorism by Alberto Abadi, professor of economics in MIT, holds rather fascinating information that in his study accounting for per capita national income and its relationship towards terrorism, found that they were not significantly associated with each other. Rather, he found that countries which held lower levels of political rights are linked to higher levels of terrorism and vice versa. However, this relationship between political rights and terrorism is not a simple one, as he also found that countries with intermediate range of political rights experience greater risk of terrorism than countries that host either very high or low levels of political rights. How Abadi explains this finding is by stating that autocratic regimes tend to eliminate political dissent. However, nation-states which display an intermediate level of political freedoms are often seen during times of political transition, when governments are seen as relatively weak or indecisive, thus playing a part in the incitement of political instability, which may be seen as a great breeding ground for terror. Looking at another study known as Education, Poverty, and Terrorism, Is There a Causal Connection by Alan B. Kruger and Jika Malkova, found that there's little to suggest a direct connection between poverty or education with participation in terrorism. In fact, their study referenced the work Profile of a Terrorist by Charles A. Russell and Bowman H. Miller, where they found that many individuals involved in terrorist activities as cadres or leaders are in fact well-educated, coming from some university training. In brief, both Kruger and Malakova hypothesized that educated people are more likely to participate in politics, in part since political involvement requires interest and commitment, and that terrorism is a violent form of political involvement. Ending the study, they stated that there is actually little optimism that a reduction in poverty or an increase in educational attainment would lead to any meaningful reduction in the amount of international terrorism. These studies looked at terrorism at the aggregate level, so for the sake of argument, perhaps looking at terrorism at the psychological level would yield different results. To this end, we take a look at the work The Psychology of Terrorism by John Horgan. In his analysis, he states that there is no individual psychological traits that distinguish terrorists from the general population. In fact, much of the book he emphasized that terrorism is more of a collective response, revolving around a charismatic leader or a greater cause. Similarly, Philip Bobbitt in his work Terror and Consent states a unique phenomena, that when individuals join terror cells or pledge loyalty to them, essentially denounce their identity as individuals in favor of a cause. In short, individuals within terror cells are often absorbed into the collective, with a greater mission of the group. With this information in mind, perhaps we should add another method at analyzing terror. Earlier in this video essay, we described the case of the Zealots. What was first an isolated group grew into a much larger movement. We will expand on this concept. At first, Zealots were seen as an underground movement. However, as their attacks escalated, the Romans reacted, often over-aggressively, thus becoming more authoritative within the region, with state expansion unintentionally bolstering the cause of the Zealots. Additionally, there are similar cases to this. During the Dirty War in Argentina between 74 to 83, a leftist guerrilla outfit known as Montoneros grew in prominence. Like other left-wing guerrillas at the time, their views and methods often led them towards isolation from the greater population. Attributing their group identity as a Marxist struggle, the guerrilla outfit held a stratagem they wished to pursue. By utilizing terror tactics, the Montoneros outfit wanted to cause an overreaction by the Argentine government, which ultimately expanded the authority of the state within the country. To be incredibly brief on the subject, this eventually led to the military coup in 1976, when General Jorge Rafael Videla came to power. And as many have already covered, this began a brand new level of crackdowns, in addition with a new degree of attacks coming from Montoneros and similar groups. In retrospect, a feedback loop of terror can be seen. With each attack from Montoneros, the Argentine state took on new powers and authority to combat the guerrilla outfit. But from each state expansion, Montoneros and similar groups utilized the response as a just cause. For originally only seen as radical militants, these groups portrayed themselves more and more as freedom fighters. The lighter ban on political parties only exacerbated this issue. In this case, terror seemed cyclical for a time, with each cycle becoming more complex and bloody. However, an interesting thought experiment can come from this event. If the rise of Montoneros never happened, would the Argentine military still form a military coup? While that question is still being debated to this day, it would be prudent to analyze why and how these terrorist cells grew. Moving on, let's take a look at another situation, the 1916 Easter Rising. Now, this event is especially interesting since it gave rise to later terror acts that the IRA would later employ. During Easter Monday on April 24th, 1916, Irish nationalists proclaimed the establishment of the Irish Republic. They would later seize multiple buildings in Dublin and clash with British troops. Now, initially, there was little support from the greater Irish population prior to the rising. However, public opinion would soon change. Within a week, the insurrection was put down with Irish forces routed by the British. After the surrender by the Irish nationalist leaders, more than 3,000 people were taken prisoner, many of which had no part in the rising, and close to 2,000 were sent to internment or prison camps, with most of the leaders of the rising executed. This particular kind of reaction towards the Easter Rising backfired, however, as prior to the event, there was little support from the Irish population supporting the rising, but due to the brutal response, public opinion blasted against the British. And as many watching would already know, this would lead to additional conflict between both the British and the Irish. Looking at another case, let's briefly analyze the events leading up to the First Intifada in Israel and Palestine. Being in an already unstable political climate since the fallout of the Israeli War of Independence, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, another event would transpire. By 1985, Israel opened up its labor markets for Palestinians, in which they were recruited to do unskilled or semi-skilled labor. By 1987, around 40% of the Palestinian labor force worked within Israel. However, due to the increasing population density, along with rising unemployment, conflict was arising. During this time period, the amount of Israeli settlements on the West Bank steadily increased between 35,000 in 1984 to 64,000 in 1988. In response to these events, Gad Yaakov stated that a creeping process of de facto annexation would lead to a rising level of animosity against Israel within Palestinian society. So when the First Intifada occurred, it was not initiated by any single individual, organization, or leader, but rather came as a reaction from the general population. On December 8, 1987, an Israeli tank collided into vehicles holding Palestinians arriving from work. 4 Palestinians were killed, and several others injured. This incident will later cause mass demonstrations, along with embittering the region with even more tension. So what do all of these cases have in common? To the Zealot Roman case of Judea, the Argentine Montoneros situation, the Easter Rising event, and the First Intifada. Before anything, there will always be individuals who hold radical opinions in any society. Under normal conditions, they are isolated away from the greater population. But given certain circumstances, these radicals can grow and proliferate. For example, what was once a fringe movement known as the Zealots grew in numbers, and as the Romans instituted more authoritative measures, no longer were they seen as boorish radicals, but rather freedom fighters as far as public image went. With that kind of moral support, new recruits flooded in. In the Argentine case, the Montoneros group deliberately utilized terror acts to cause the Argentine government to overreact, which in turn fed into their cause. And with the military coup, the Montoneros group finally held a reason to justify their aggression, as the fight shifted from just isolated cells skirmishing in the wilderness, but rather rebels combating a military dictatorship, which as a result made it easier for these groups to gain moral support, and thus new blood. And during the Easter Rising, at first the greater Irish population had little support for the nationalist movement, but after the brutal response of the British, in which many were taken into internment camps and executed. It began a domino effect of violence, which again fed into the Irish nationalist cause, giving them more legitimacy and new recruits. Moving on to the First Intifada, when Israel became more encroaching towards Palestinians, such as the implementation of the Iron Fist policy, which included the rise of settlements on the West Bank, further delegitimized Israel's role as an economic partner, but rather as an authoritative entity. So what can we take from these different cases? Again, there will always be radicals in any population set, hardliners within political movements that wish to take things to a very coercive level. For the most part, these hardliners seldom find support from greater populations. However, if an event occurs that gives them legitimacy for their actions, such as a Roman occupation or a military coup, these same hardliners will grow in support, and in the process, will find new recruits. In other words, terrorism may be a form of warfare that cannot be reduced by conventional means alone. A terrorist cell requires new recruits. As long as they can draw in more blood, they can go on indefinitely. However, what causes individuals to join these kinds of organizations? During the Zealot Roman case, individuals did not just join the Zealots, they just wanted to get rid of the Roman occupation. With the Argentine case, due to the military coup, rebels grew in numbers due to the thought of fighting against a dictatorship. Similarly, with the Easter Rising case, the Irish didn't just want to join a military faction, but rather to achieve Irish independence. To utilize a modern example, how the Islamic State came to power is rather interesting. What began as a hardliner group within Al-Qaeda under Zarqawi and later other leaders, steadily became more prominent as they voiced grievances against Shiite Muslims. The man known as Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq from 2006 to 2014, further drove the country to be more of a sectarian state, limiting regional autonomy as stated in the Constitution of Iraq, in favor of a more centralized government authority, which led to a rise in both Kurdish and Sunni resentment, which has played into the hands of the recruiting efforts of the Islamic State. In brief, many terrorist cells wish to be legitimized by the greater public. Indeed, the worst thing that could happen to these organizations is to lose the very reason they exist, to ultimately become redundant. Taking a look about the Monteneros case and the Easter Rising event. After the wake of the Falkland War against Britain, the Argentine military junta fell in favor of the Raúl Alfonsin civilian government. As a result, it restored basic civil liberties and retracted the ban on political parties. As a result of this new opening, there was seldom a reason for new recruits to join organizations like Monteneros. As the government shifted in its policies, so did the reason for these organizations to be morally supported. Looking at the IRA situation, events now are much better than what they were back during the days surrounding the Easter Rising, in which positive political discourse has lowered tensions with the recognition of the Irish Republic. Of course, there are still hardliners within the Irish nationalist sects. However, they are becoming more and more isolated from the greater population. As stated by former IRA hunger striker Tommy McKerney, there are now so many groups claiming to be IRA, it's becoming nonsensical. Such groups are completely mistaken and misguided. There is no justification or support for any armed campaign, and it will certainly not succeed. In other words, as long as public legitimacy does not flow into these hardliner groups, as long as another Easter Rising-like event does not happen, hardliners and radicals alike will likely remain in isolation and redundancy. So what to take away from all this? Cycles of terror cannot flourish without state mismanagement, confusion, and sympathy. In a paper known as Political Tension and the Size of Governments by Richard M. Kirk, he ends with an edifying note. Consider the public relations incentives of terrorist organizations. Watson states that financial assistance is merely the tangible manifestation of a more important form of support that must precede it: psychological condemnation. Kaplan observes that terror becomes acceptable when the ends it is meant to serve are seen as absolutes. Consequently, it is in the vested financial interest of terrorist organizations to perpetuate the concept of ideological obsession, thereby creating confusion and sympathy for the cause. Wow, that took a while to get out. Hope you enjoyed this video essay. All cited material can be found within the description. Now, since this is the first video on the channel, I thought I'd take some time to explain what exactly this video is, and what is the Night Owl channel. This is a channel that will cover cases found in both political and economic realms. Night Owl utilizes 2D animation as a part of its format. Additionally, this video essay was meant to act as only as a matter of discussion towards the determinants of terror and is up for public critique and debate. If you believe something is off or missing found within this video, please comment below and I will add corrections on a pinned comment. By all means, add your critiques. In the end, it will benefit us all. If you enjoyed this project, please support on Patreon, which kinda reminds me, this channel will not be monetized. In fact, I will not monetize any Night Owl videos. The reason why I'm doing so is I'm not the biggest fan of how ad revenue is generated on this site. If you want a deeper explanation, feel free to comment below and I will give you a more detailed response. I realize this video in particular may have tons of mistakes that I'm currently, as I'm recording, am unaware of. One critique I personally have with this video is that a strong counter-argument can be made for selection bias. And if I'm being perfectly honest, this channel is a passion project of mine. If anyone recognizes my voice, they will likely remember my work on the McIntyre channel. Long story short, I just wanted to create different content, so I moved on from that channel. I hope you found some utility in this video, or maybe this whole channel was just some big mistake. I'll find out as time goes on. Regardless of what happens though, have a wonderful rest of the day or night, and please do take care of yourselves.